the squat, now you guys are all familiar with what the squat is. You put the weight on your back, you squat it down, and you get it back up, right? I'm not going to go into that remedial of information level for you guys today. But in the squat, of course, the primary muscle that we're going to be using is the quads as well as the glutes, right? The quads contribute to knee extension, the glutes contribute to hip extension, and those are really the main drivers there. You can make a case for the calves being a part of that, that triple extension, because your ankle joint does flex a little bit in the squat, and then you will extend it up. There's a little bit of range of motion there in the calf, but frankly, the calf is much more of a supporting, stabilizing muscle for the squat. Definitely not the big driver there. That's just going to be your quads and your glutes. It's also worth mentioning the adductors. The adductors play a huge role. The adduction is bringing your limbs into anatomical positions. So in your legs, the adductors are what bring your legs from a spread out stance to close together. That would be anatomical if you were standing straight up. And so, especially depending on how wide of a stance you take in your squat, which is something that we'll go into a little bit just here next. But especially as you do a wider squat, some people would consider it a sumo squat. But the wider you go, the more you're going to use your adductors, because as you go down in that range of motion, your knees are going to abduct from your body, and you need to adduct them back in. Yeah, especially if you haven't squatted for a while, you might be able to kind of feel your adductors more so than you have. Actually, some of you might be familiar with Greg O'Gallagher. He's a fitness influencer, one of the more originals. Anyways, he has this philosophy. I followed it for a little while ago when I was probably 18 or 19 years old. He doesn't really train his legs, at least not with like heavy squats and heavy deadlifts. But I mean, he trains them, right? Not chicken legs. I don't want to make it sound like I'm calling bad on Greg, but he just prioritizes aesthetics more than anything, I think, and he wants to have like athletic legs. And so in his program that he puts out, the one that I followed for a little while, he does Bulgarian split squats, which are a unilateral exercise. So you're working one leg at a time, and because of that, there's no abduction or adduction of your legs throughout that movement. And before, I loved to do heavy back squats, but I wanted to try the Bulgarian split squats and things for a little while. Eventually, I decided I didn't like it, and I wanted to go back to doing my squats. And when I returned to that, I couldn't do near as heavy the weight as I used to be able to, just because I felt like my adductors were so weak and underused. And so they were a big component of my squat, at least at that time. And I don't know. I've never had that experience since, so maybe they still are a very big component of my squat nowadays, but I just don't know. Anyways, when I hadn't trained my adductors in that way for a long time, my squat really kind of suffered. So the adductors, long way of me saying that the adductors definitely play a role into your back squat. The lower back as well, of course, that is going to depend as well on your bar height, how much your lower back comes into play there. But for everyone, you are going to need to use your lower back, your back extensors, to maintain the uprightness of your torso with that heavy weight on it. We already talked about your calves, kind of as a supporting element of the squat. And then, of course, your arms and your shoulders are going to come into play, bracing. So that shouldn't be super fatiguing on your arms necessarily, but as we'll get into later, some people wear wrist wraps to kind of help support their wrists as they are bracing with their arms for that back squat, as well as some people really feel like their brace, just holding that heavy weight up on their back during their back squat, kind of can affect their bench press. I don't really feel like that personally, but some people do, and that's totally okay. Moving on, I mean, of course, we talked about all the muscles there of the mechanics of the squats. Of course, the femur is really going to be, is the bone that kind of connects all this. So your knee joint, your hip joint are the two joints in play, really, and then your femur really is the bone that is moving during this squat, right? So it's worth mentioning, everyone squats a little differently, right? We can talk about averages, we can talk about how things normally go, but everyone's biomechanics and lever lengths of their body be it your legs for your squat and your deadlift, be it your arms for your bench press, or whatever the lift is, are going to be a little different, and people are going to sometimes struggle because of that. Sometimes they're going to have a big advantage because of that. And a great example actually is my wife and I. My wife and I actually have pretty similar length legs. She's 5'7", so that's 5 inches shorter than me. But our legs are actually pretty much the same length. She has very, very long femurs, and for that reason, squatting is a lot harder for her. So if you think about that, the longer the femur, kind of the more distance you have to move that weight, the more work is done in the system of that barbell, that weight makes your squat a little harder. Whereas if someone has short femurs, that range of motion gets cut pretty short because of that. They're able to stay very, very upright, and so their femur length comes into play in a big way right there. Moving into the technique of the squat, the rules for a powerlifting squat are simply that your hip joint needs to pass below your knee joint. So that is slightly, some people squat to 90 degrees, and obviously that's super limited range of motion squat. Some people squat to the point where their femur is parallel with the ground. So in this powerlifting squat, it's actually going to be slightly below parallel. So that hip joint needs to come below the knee joint. And that's all the rule is. But then the technique of how we can make this squat most effective, the first thing you should know is that you want to keep the barbell, the weight, over your midfoot. So just think about your foot, right? Maybe you are familiar with this and maybe you're not, but you have the ball of your foot at the front, right by your toes. You have the heel of your foot. You kind of have your side of your foot, your outside of your foot kind of touches the ground, and then you have your arch in the middle. The inside of your arch probably doesn't touch the ground so much, right? So the mid foot is actually kind of going to be the front of that arch, kind of where the ball and the arch come together. And again, of course, depending on your feet, maybe some people have long feet or shorter feet or different feet, but really it's going to be about at that arch, the top of that arch or the front of the arch. And you want to keep the bar over that because that's going to be the middle of your base of support, right? Of course, your feet are what's supporting you throughout this squat. You want to keep that weight right above the middle so that you are as sturdy as possible. And if it comes off of that midline, the weight, then you can kind of fall forward, fall backward, get kind of unstable, and it's really going to kind of be at the detriment of your squat. With that in mind, we should discuss a high bar squat versus a low bar squat. So high bar and low bar has to do with where you rest the weight on your back. Now, there's kind of pros and cons of both, but first thing I want to address, like I said, with keeping that bar over the midline of your foot is the distance of, the distance of that barbell from your hip joint, right? So if that barbell is actually very, very close to your hip joint, you might actually have to lean over really, really far to keep that barbell over that midline where you want it to be during your squat. And so that could really, really be taxing on your lower back and your back extensors. So if that's kind of a weak point for you, maybe you've experienced injuries and struggles with that sometimes before, then you might want to consider doing a higher or a high bar back squat. The thing about a high bar back squat is it's that greater distance from your hip joint, which in one sense means that there's a longer range of motion, right? A longer lever. Same way with your femurs that we just talked about. The longer that lever is, technically the harder it's going to be. So a lot of people feel like they can go a lot heavier on a low bar back squat. However, the thing is you're going to be able to maintain much more of an upright posture. And with that more upright posture, your lower back extensors are not going to be quite as limiting as they are with a lower back squat. So you really kind of have to feel it out. I would not say I necessarily do a high bar squat or necessarily do a low bar squat. I anchor the bar on the bottom of my traps. So kind of where my traps and my shoulders meet, there's kind of like that natural groove, right, in your back muscles. I like to rest the barbell just right there. That is probably just considered traditional. High bar would be when the squat bar is kind of on top of your traps, sitting and pushing down on them. And a low bar squat was when you go much lower than that natural kind of crease in your back. You go a lot lower, and again, there's pros and there's cons to both. I really would recommend just doing a traditional squat and then kind of going from there and feeling it out, what you like to do. If you like to do a little higher or you like to do a little lower, most people probably will just prefer a nice and traditional squat. Another thing to talk about with the squat is external hip rotation. So what you can think about there is kind of a narrow versus a wide stance squat. That's really going to be our biggest driver. I think it's called a cannonball squat. I haven't heard that phrase in a long time, so maybe that's outdated and people don't call it that anymore. But a squat where you have your feet right next to each other. I think the idea is right. You almost like you're squatting on top of a cannonball, and it is very quad dominant because to get full depth, your knees have to bend a very, very great range of motion. So it's quad dominant squat, cannonball squat. If you go out and you do a lot wider of a squat, just think about this with me. If you were to keep your feet parallel with each other, the wider and the wider you get, your ankles really aren't going to be able to support that in terms of their rotation, and it's going to be kind of awkward. So usually how it goes is the wider you put your feet, the more externally you rotate your feet. So that is just taking your toes, rotating them out so that, the reason for it is so that your hips and your femurs kind of just don't get in each other's way, if that kind of makes any sense. You should try it out, really. If you're kind of confused what I'm saying, go get, I don't know, not too much weight on the bar, but try it out, like with your different, foot angles and your different widths and everything. You'll notice, like if you were to do a cannonball squat as I've described, you're going to get to a point where it kind of feels like your hips and your legs are fighting into each other, they're getting in each other's way. And so if you were, even from a cannonball squat, just to rotate your feet outwards and have this big angle of rotation of your feet. Well, one thing I should make sure to say is that when you squat, you want to keep your knees going in the same direction as your toes, right? So some people will say, oh, you can't externally rotate your feet. That's bad for you. It's not bad for you at all if your knees go in that direction, right? So if your knees and your feet are going in different directions, that is bad for you. You should stop that. You should figure out what you're doing. But as long as your knees and your feet are going in that same direction, even from that very, very narrow squat, you'll notice that that kind of goes away. It's a little easier to hit that range of motion. And that's really what that tool is, that external rotation of your hip. It's something that I do. It's something that I really recommend to people who do have long femurs. So my wife, for example, she really likes to go pretty wide on her squat because, well, if you think about it, if you look at it, a squat from a side profile, the more you externally rotate your legs, when you get to the bottom of that squat, you will have externally rotated your femurs. And then that kind of technically from a side profile view makes that femur shorter. Now it's not literally actually shorter because you still have to, contract your muscles to move that bone over that same length regardless of where it is. But if you look at from that side profile, that bottom of that squat, which can be very valuable to do and optimize, then you've shortened that lever arm a little bit, making that squat a little easier because of that external rotation of your hips. It's not something that you have to do, but it is something that I'd recommend. When I squat, I take about a 30-degree external rotation. So if my feet were parallel from each other, I personally, on my heels, rotate them about 30 degrees, and that's my ideal squat form. When you talk about squat width, I would not recommend doing that cannonball form, that really, really narrow squat, if your goal is to lift as much as possible, just because it's quad dominant, right? We want to try and find a balance of what is going to be working both of the major muscle groups, in this case the quads and the glutes, as much as possible, because if they're both being worked and utilized as much as possible, then hypothetically we would be lifting as much weight as possible. Sometimes people will like to go really, really wide on their squat, and like I said, you could call that a sumo squat, and that is going to be more glute dominant. Some people like that because their glutes are a lot stronger than their quads and they feel like they do well in that regard. If that's the case, that's great. A lot of people will say shoulder width, but just to be a little more specific, what I like to do when I squat is to put my heels under my shoulders. So I've already mentioned that I rotate my toes a little bit outwards from my heels, but I like to keep my heels at shoulder width and then rotate my feet out. And again, if you're paying attention, that is going to put my base of support, the midline of my foot, a little bit outside of shoulder width. And that just feels really, really good for me. But again, my shins and my femurs and my feet and my everything is going to be slightly different proportions than yours are. And everyone else listening to this, right? We're all going to be a little different. So I hope to explain these principles to you well enough that you can kind of go and experiment. Now, as you're listening, please listen with an open mind, I should say. I actually don't consider myself having perfected my squat form until like 6 months ago. Genuinely. I've been in the gym and I've been lifting weights for years now, about 8 years. And that whole time, my squat form has been pretty bad. It actually took me several years as I was a teenager to get to the point where my squat was actually deep enough to count for anything. I, unknowingly, didn't squat very deep at all. And so my squats would not have counted really for anything. And then beyond that, I really struggled getting them to the right depth because it was easier for just me to squat all the way down. And that kind of made it trickier for me in figuring out my right, hip rotation and everything like that. It really took a long time. And for me to get to the point where I really felt like I had it down to that perfect science, perfect for me, was literally about 6 months ago. So the majority of my lifting career, I would not say that I've had a good squat. If you really feel like you have a perfect squat, then congrats. I mean, that's awesome. And maybe just you can keep some of this in mind of why your squat form is the way that it is. However, for a lot of people, even me 7 months ago, I would have valued to listen to some of this information and kind of apply it. So really try and think about some of these things. Next time you go during your warm-up sets for your squat, just try and be intentional and think about why you're squatting the way you're squatting and see if you could change anything. Some people really don't know why they squat the way they squat, and they just put their feet where they think they ought to and they go. And I mean, it's good to be intuitive with the way that you're going to move your body. There's a big thing to say about that. I don't mean to make anybody over-engineer their squat or anything like that or any of these lifts. Really, I mean, if you are squatting pretty heavy, you take this heavy barbell off the rack and then you have to spend a lot of time and mental energy getting everything just perfectly where it's supposed to be, then that is going to be to the detriment of your squat, whereas this information is supposed to be helpful for your squat. So again, I don't mean to help anyone overthink or over-engineer or overanalyze. Don't want paralysis by analysis, if you've heard that before. I just want to give you some tools and hopefully just keep it in mind and work a thing in or two until it's habit, and then hopefully you can get a really good squat form from there. Another thing that you should be thinking about as you do your squat is thinking of your foot as a tripod. Now, I'm sure you've heard that triangles are the strongest shape. That's true, but why is that? Well, if you think about it, we live in a three-dimensional world, and so if you have something sitting on 3 legs, it is actually going to be perfectly balanced. So I'm sure some of you guys have had an experience with a desk or a chair at school or at work that just kind of doesn't quite sit right and it kind of wobbles. Maybe you shove a piece of paper that you folded up a few times under there to try and level it out well. Well, that's because we don't live in a 4-dimensional world. We live in a 3-dimensional world. And so 3 of those legs are always going to meet each other really, really well to support whatever the object is. The 4th one, I mean, it could meet well, but it's not bound to be perfect, right? If you just have a 3-legged stool or a 3-legged tower or a 3-legged anything, it is always going to, all of the weight is going to be distributed well between those 3 bases of support. So think of your foot as a tripod, and those 3 bits of that tripod are going to be, first of all, your heel, and then they're going to be the 2 sides of the ball of your foot. So just visualize that. I mean, regardless of whether or not you visualize that, it's kind of going to be true, but when you can kind of visualize that and keep that in mind, really, we build from the ground up. So if you have a really, really strong support base on your squat or whatever it is, then we're only going to be able to work up from there. You can never be stronger than your base of support. So try and think about that, be intentional with that, get a really, really good support with your foot. Think of it as a tripod. The last thing I wanted to talk about is sticking points. So, I mean, every lift is going to have a sticking point. It's just where it's slowest, where it feels the heaviest. And usually what that has to do with is our leverages, right? So I hope you guys are all familiar with how a lever works. But when we're using a lever for the sake of mechanical advantage, the way it works is just that we are moving an object over a shorter distance with a lever that is a longer distance. So when you apply force at a longer distance than you're moving the object, you can apply less force than it would actually take to lift that object, right? So if you're trying to lift a rock that's 100 pounds an inch, and you had a big long lever that you could move 100 inches, then it would only take a pound of force on the end of that lever. So that is how levers can work to our good. However, when we're lifting weights, the lever arms of our bodies are actually working kind of against us. So like if you're trying to use a lever for mechanical advantage, you want it to be as long as you possibly can. However, when the force is acting against you, with the lever being your femur, for example, in this case of the squat, then when that lever is the longest, that is actually bad, right? That's where it feels the heaviest. So how we experience this when we squat is when our femur is parallel to the ground, then technically that is when the lever is longest, right? Because gravity always pushes straight down. And so when we're at sort of an angle, the gravity is pushing straight down over a shorter distance because of that angle. But when there's no angle, the distance is greatest, and that's when the force is going to technically feel greatest. Now, what we've already discussed is that a competition standard squat is when the hip joint passes below the knee joint. And so you're going to get to that point where it's very heaviest, and then you're going to keep going. And then to do that squat up, though it's only a small bit, you're actually going to get progressively heavier as you go back up to that parallel and then go beyond, right? So the sticking point is going to be when your femur is at parallel. And so really what you want to try and do is focus on that bottom part and really try and explode out of the bottom and make it through that bottom or through that parallel portion, because that's where it's going to feel the heaviest. And then if you're able to get past that, it should be smooth sailing from there, and it should just be easier and easier all the way up. Some people experience things like that differently. You know, we're going to talk about that same phenomenon that I just described with our arm and our leg lengths with some of our other lifts, and some people just feel differently. Some people really struggle at the tops of lifts and not at the bottom. Some people really struggle at the bottom, and then as soon as the bottom's over, they're home free. But that is hypothetically how it should be on average. Again, like I've said, with everything so far and for everything that I'm going to continue to go over in this episode, think about it, apply it to yourself. Experiment during your warm-ups and things, and apply these principles bit by bit. And then hopefully, as you experiment with yourself using these principles, you'll be able to get these lifts as best as you possibly can. Now, moving on, let's talk about the ankle joint, actually. The ankle, for many people, is not very flexible. So if you talk about like stretching your calf, so your toes would come up towards your knees, towards your shins, many people struggle with that. Many people do not have very flexible ankles in that regard. Now, that can actually be problematic on our squat because, as we've talked about, you do that triple extension as we go up on a squat. So that just means that your ankle and your knee and your hip are all going to straighten out. It's the opposite of that when you come down. So as you're coming down on your squat, your ankle is going to bend slightly, but it can only bend as far as you are flexible. And so if you had a very not flexible ankle at all, you would have to lean forward very far to keep that weight over your midfoot, right? Whereas if you had a more agile ankle, your knees could go further forward, which would also then bring your hips further forward, which means you could have a slightly more upright posture and keep that barbell in line. Whereas your ankles, if they're, not very agile, are going to prevent that. And that can actually be another reason why some people have a big struggle hitting depth, for example, just because they feel like they can't without, falling over, things like that. So that's why you'll sometimes see people squatting with their heels on like a plate or a box. I think some people actually sell like platforms where it's an angled platform that you can stand on. And what that basically does, it doesn't make your ankles more agile or more flexible or anything like that. But when you bring your foot down, then your maximum flexibility of your ankle is going to, in that regard, bring your knee further forward, bring your hips further forward, and help you keep that slightly more upright posture. We're going to go into, in just a little bit, some of the equipment. Squat shoes actually have a slightly elevated heel for that same reason. Now, this is actually how we can kind of get back into that external hip rotation. The more you externally rotate your hips, you might actually be able to avoid some of those issues, right? Obviously, in a powerlifting meet, if you're just trying to hit a PR at the gym, there really aren't any rules. You can squat with your heels up on a plate, or whatever it is that you'd like to do. If you're going to be doing a powerlifting meet, though, nobody's going to let you do that. Hopefully, you could invest in these shoes or whatever. But really, the solution is to try and make your ankles as agile as you possibly can. Now, that's hard. I mean, your ankles of all things are not as easy to make more flexible than perhaps your hamstrings. Some people, bend over and touch your toes. Can you do it? Well, then you have pretty flexible hamstrings. And if you can't do it, that's something you can work up to. Your ankles might be a little harder. One thing that I have heard and tried out, I don't know the scientific backing behind this, but is I heard that if you stretch out your big toe, it can actually kind of help your ankle become more agile, kind of release some of the tension or whatever in there. Again, that is not super scientific of me, but I did try it. I kind of liked it. So if you really are having trouble with your ankle flexibility, perhaps that is something that you could try. But just know that really your ankles come into play more than perhaps you might think. That can actually be, again, like I said, a big reason that people don't feel like they can hit depth. Because, if your ankles are not very agile, then you have to lean over really, really far forward to keep that weight over your midfoot. You might just feel like you're falling backwards if you're not able to do that. And it can be really, really be tough and frankly a little dangerous if you're having to worry about that. So whatever your solution is going to be, ideally we kind of fix the root of the issue, which is the ankle itself. But you could wear a squat shoe, or you could lift on a heel or a platform, or a plate, a 45-pound plate on the ground, whatever it is that you'd like to do. Just keep that in mind, and then hopefully we can think about that as we continue to go on. The next thing I want to talk about is our squat cues. Now, some of you might be saying, what does he even mean by that? What is a cue? And a cue is just something you focus on mentally, something that, as you're getting ready to perform your lift and your exercise, just something that you're paying mental attention to, and you're making sure that you are, maybe engaging a certain muscle or getting your body into a certain way. And then just thinking about these cues can just kind of help set you up for success. So that is a cue. It's something you think about, and it's like your pre-flight check if you're like an airline pilot, right? There's a certain list of things you need to make sure are all good before you take off. And so for your squat, for your bench, for your deadlift, there are similar things. Now, I'm going to talk about some of the cues that I know of and that I use myself. But one thing that you should keep in mind is that you don't want to have too many cues. It is totally possible to have too many. Because again, if you have, hundreds of pounds of weight on your back, and then when you step off from the rack, you have this big laundry list of things that you need to make sure are all taken care of before you're actually just going to do your squat or your bench or your deadlift or whatever, you're going to waste a lot of energy. You're going to kind of fatigue yourself just standing there where you could have used that energy better. So, it's okay to have lots of different things going on and lots of different cues over your life. A good way to do it, I would say, is to pick one or two cues and then just do them over and over and over and over until it's a habit. Because once a cue is a habit, it's not really even a cue anymore. So that should make it a little easier for you. But when you are doing your cues, I guess I should say perhaps as you're learning cues that are not habits yet, you shouldn't have more than 3. If you have less than 3, that's great too, but you should not have more than 3. I would limit you to 3. Now, thankfully for that, for the squat, I really couldn't even think of too many. For one, a lot of cues for all these different lifts are just to be tight all around. But that's kind of, I mean, just general. It doesn't really mean anything to be tight. All that kind of makes you think about is just activating all your muscles, which is a great way to get ready to lift very, very heavy. But anyways, going into specific cues for the squat. One that I really like, still really helps me to this day, is to try and screw your feet into the ground. Now, what you're going to want to externally rotate your feet both ways. Of course, screws go in one way and out the other for your feet. Obviously, we're going to ignore that. I hope that's obvious. You're just going to try and kind of like rotate your toes out, and almost like you're screwing them and tightening them down into the ground. And really what that is going to help you do is activate some of your glutes and get things in a really good tight position where everything's kind of turned on and fired and ready. So that way when you get to the bottom of the squat, everything that you're going to need to activate is kind of already activated. That really is what getting tight means, is just getting everything sort of kind of contracted and kind of turned on, so that way when it comes time, it's ready, and then you're going to have a much better chance being explosive out of the bottom of that movement and lifting well. So think about that. Hopefully that makes sense to you, because it really is helpful to me to try and screw your feet in the ground. Twist them into your shoes until they can't twist anymore, and just keep everything really, really tight and sturdy and solid. Another one that I like to keep in mind, and I actually see this mistake a lot, is to bring your pelvis underneath you. And so a great way to think about that is to either to contract your abdominal muscles, or to think about bringing your pelvis closer to your rib cage. And the reason for that is because, well, the weight is on top of your back, and some people will kind of have their lower back arched out and their pelvis and their glutes kind of out behind them, and I guess it's an overextension of their lower back muscles. And I think a lot of people do that because they know that you do need to extend and isometrically hold your lower back as you do a squat. But when you do it that much, it's actually kind of to your detriment. You want to get your pelvis underneath that weight so that it transfers more directly to your lifting that weight. So bring your pelvis underneath the weight, or you can think of it as contracting your abs, or you can think of it as bringing your pelvis to your rib cage. That's actually what I do. I like to think about, as I'm taking my breath and I'm going to brace into my belt, I like keeping my pelvis and my rib cage close together if I can. And that really just helps put all of that force from your legs into that barbell. On that topic, good cue is to take a big belly breath. For the squat and for the deadlift, you want to take a belly breath. For the bench, you want to take a chest breath. We'll talk about that why briefly. But for the squat and the deadlift, you want to take a big belly breath and breathe and brace really, really hard into your belt. And we're also going to talk about the belt in a little more detail here shortly. But that is what is going to really, really get you that rigid, rigid core, in the same way as having your pelvis underneath that load. The more rigid your core is, the better all of that force that you produce with your legs is going to transition into that barbell on top of your back, and you're going to be doing a little better. The last cue I like to think about is actually not before I lift the weight, but as I lift the weight, is when you get to that bottom, I really, really just try and think about exploding and being as fast as I can be in that bottom portion of the lift, especially as I get to that parallel femur point where it's going to be the hardest. Really try and explode and go fast and take a little bit of that momentum from that speed through that sticking point of the squat, so that hopefully you can get over it and your squat will be good to go. One more thing I do want to talk about as well is your step out, your re-rack. I've actually seen lots of funny videos, perhaps you've seen them as well, about people saying like when they unrack a squat bar and they're about to do a squat and they're trying to get their foot placement just right, and then it looks like they're doing like a cha-cha dance or something like that, just because it kind of takes a lot of these little micro adjustments for a lot of people to get that just right. Now again, I want you to think about, if you have hundreds of pounds of weight on your back, you don't want to waste a lot of energy, because as you're walking around, you're going to have all that weight on one foot. Though, I mean, you're at a lockout and it's for a brief moment, but that can be really fatiguing to try and walk around with that weight. So the best technique that you can do is to unrack it. I like to unrack it with my feet right close together. I don't know why, that just feels good to me. Maybe it's because that kind of gives me a little bit of extra height that makes it a little easier for me to unrack it. But I like to unrack it like that. And then the technique for your step back is to take one big step back, one medium step back, and then one little step back to match your feet. So again, you're going to unrack it, and then you're going to take one large step back, then that, say, with your left foot. So that's what I do, is I start with my left foot. You're going to take a big step back, and then my right foot is going to take a medium step, and that medium step is actually going to go a little bit further back than where my large step took my left foot. And then I'm going to do my last little baby step just to match the position of my left and right foot. From there, sometimes I do need to spread my feet out a little more, or maybe I need to rotate them out a little bit more. That's okay if you need to do that, but I would definitely recommend to practice that step out. On every single one of your sets, try and just take it super serious, and even if you're not using a ton of weight on your warm-ups and everything, take it really serious. Try and get your step out really, really good so that you can get into that optimal squat stance without wasting too much energy. Now I want to move on to the equipment that we are allowed to use during your squat. And I'm going to be talking about all the equipment I can think of, starting with knee sleeves. Knee sleeves are very, very common in your squat, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's just a short sleeve that goes on top of your knee. Now it is a sleeve. It is a tube that you slide on up over your calves and up to your knee. And a lot of times they're pretty thick and very, very tight. There's obviously a little bit of advantage trying to get them to be as tight as they can be. Now the reason we have knee sleeves is, well, there's a few different reasons. First one is just for a little bit of stability to that joint, especially your knee has things like your patella in there, which is not part of the joint. Think about your elbow. You don't have a patella equivalent on your elbow, which is actually why you can hit your funny bone on your elbow. Fun fact for you if you didn't know that. But say, for example, like if you had a problem with dislocating your kneecaps, some people do, the knee sleeve would actually be like an incredible tool, because it kind of just keeps that little bit of pressure and stability on your knee. Now, obviously, most people don't have problems with their patella dislocating, and they still benefit from knee sleeves, but it's that same idea, just a nice little hug around your knee to help it keep stable. That's also going to help with blood flow as well, which can be really, really beneficial. And it is going to offer a little bit of elasticity to your joint. So when you get down to the bottom of the squat, if it's tight and everything, it's going to be a little bit elastic, and it's going to provide a little bit of force into your knee joint and help you get that weight up. So that can be a benefit of that. Now, it is different though from knee wraps. Now, again, a knee sleeve is like a sock with a hole in it. You slide it all the way up your leg over your knees. Knee wraps is just a long wrap, right? So it's this long piece of cloth, and you start it and you wrap it around and around and around. You don't slide it up your leg, you just wrap it around your knees. Now, knee wraps, obviously they are kind of going to offer the same benefits as knee sleeves, but really their benefit and their purpose is elasticity. Their goal is just to act as one huge rubber band that when you get down to the bottom of that squat is really just going to slingshot you up to the top of that squat as best as possible. Now, for that reason, in most powerlifting competitions and federations, knee wraps are banned. You are not allowed to use them. Knee sleeves are okay, but knee wraps are banned. There is a separate branch of powerlifting called equipped powerlifting. It's not one that I really have any interest in. Obviously, lots of people do. But in equipped powerlifting, you are allowed to use things like knee wraps. And, well, their kind of idea is just that they use whatever tools and equipment they can to help them lift as much weight as possible. And, in these equipped meets, people can lift crazy, crazy amounts of weight because they have, these outside external aids, in this case in the form of a knee wrap. One thing that you will continuing on, I apologize. Continuing on, another piece of equipment that is very common is a singlet. Now, that is pretty much going to be for the same exact reason as your knee sleeve, but it's going to kind of be full body. It's going to include like your hips and your lower back and things. It's going to give you a little bit of stability. It's going to give you some good amount of blood flow and some small amount of elasticity. At all, high level powerlifting meets, everyone is going to be wearing a singlet. It's part of the uniform, kind of. So, maybe there are going to be people who don't prefer one piece of equipment or one piece of equipment. I think when you get very, very high level, most people are all going to kind of want to use everything that they could to their advantage. But the singlets, that's not something that I own. I don't have a singlet. Who knows how much more I could lift if I owned a singlet and used it? I don't know. But singlets are another common piece of powerlifting equipment that offer those same benefits as a knee sleeve. The next thing I wanted to talk about is the belt. The belt is truly the hallmark. When people are getting into powerlifting, the belt is really going to be probably one of the best performance enhancers that you can get. Now, some people kind of use their belts differently than others. Really, the reason that you wear a belt is for your core stability. Now, when we are lifting pretty much any lift, we want our core to have intra-abdominal pressure. We want it to be pressurized like a soda can, is a way I like to think about it. Or I have heard, I didn't come up with that, I can't take credit, but it is something that I've heard that makes sense to me, is you want it to be pressurized like a soda can. So if you had a soda can and it was unopened, it was pressurized, still had all the soda in it, you can actually support a good amount of weight. You could probably step up on it and it wouldn't break or pop or anything like that because of all that pressure supporting the aluminum can. However, as soon as you open it, even if you didn't empty it, if you just opened it and let out that pressure, you go to step on it, it is probably pretty immediately going to crumple and leak soda everywhere and make a big mess. And so that pressure really, really makes a big difference. Now, the reason that we wear a belt is because we want to put that pressure inside of our abdomen, but oftentimes when that happens, it just kind of pushes your gut out. And not to say that you can't necessarily always ever lift good if you don't have a belt for that reason. Beltless squatting and deadlifting and everything is a thing, and it's very good, and you do it during your warm-ups. Anyways, when you just get to that super, super heavy weight and you're trying to put this high amount of pressure inside of your abdominal cavity so that you can be as strong as you possibly can, the belt kind of gives you something to brace into. So rather than all of that force just pushing your gut out super, super far, is going to push your abdominal wall into that belt, and then at that point you're kind of going to stop. And again, not always, because belts are only so thick and everything like that, but it's just going to give you something to brace into. For a lot of people, admittedly myself as well, the belt also serves kind of as a lower back protective tool. And it could kind of be because of that intra-abdominal pressure that it does that. But I actually like to sit my belt relatively low on my pelvis so that it kind of is on top of my lower back. And then if I'm able to get that kind of tight on me and then put more pressure into it with my abdominal brace, it kind of keeps my lower back in line so that I don't get injured. I have struggled with a couple lower back injuries in my life, and that's just, to me, the way that it is comfortable to wear the belt. Some people don't like to wear that low, though. Some people actually prefer to wear it really pretty high, almost over their rib cage. And again, that is going to depend from person to person with your anatomy, your mechanics, and everything like that. You really just kind of need to experiment and figure out what's best for you. Now, I have experimented with a more traditional as well as even like a higher placed belt. And for me, it just doesn't feel as good. And maybe that's just because I'm not used to it and I could learn how to get used to it and then perform even better. I do understand that as a possibility, but for now, I really like to have my belt kind of sitting a little lower. And so if you don't have a belt, it's definitely something that I would recommend. There's lots of different types of the belts out there as well. I really just like the ones that buckle. There's lever belts and there are, Velcro belts and all these different things. I have tried them. I don't really love them. I just like a belt. I actually like it to be relatively thin. I've tried some thicker belts, that thick leather, and it kind of digs into me and I don't really like it as much. So I like a thinner belt that conforms to me just a little bit more. but then it's still, well, I don't know, what's my belt? Probably 5 or 6 inches thick or something. I don't know. Or not thick, but wide. Hopefully you understand what I'm trying to say. But um, I just like the buckle belt, so I can get it pretty tight, I think. And then you don't want to get your belt too tight. I really could probably do an entire podcast episode about a weightlifting belt. I never will because that doesn't sound that exciting to me. But you don't want to get it like so tight. The goal of it is not to choke you, but you want to get it tight enough that when you brace into it, you can get a really good amount of pressure. You don't want to choke yourself. You don't want to hurt yourself by getting it way too overly tight, just because that is going to cause you problems. But anyways, the belt, if you're wondering, oh, I don't have any weightlifting equipment, what is a piece of equipment that I should probably focus on getting first? I would say a belt. From there, probably is going to be our next piece of equipment that I'm going to talk about is the wrist wrap. Now, I've mentioned to you the knee wrap, and the wrist wrap is exactly that same thing, except it is for your wrist, not your knee. These are not banned, however. And the reason being is because none of these lifts in powerlifting involve the extension or the flexion of your wrist. Your wrist is just kind of trying to stay in the same place. And so for you to wrap it with something and give it that extra support, it's not, you could say definitely it's going to give you advantage. That's why you wear it. But it's not going to give you necessarily like some sort of a literal advantage in helping move the weight. So it's common to wear wrist straps definitely on your bench press, which we'll go into, but on your squat, just because as you are bracing and holding, supporting that weight with your wrists, it's so heavy sometimes that for a lot of people it kind of rolls down their back and really flexes their wrists a lot, and it kind of hurts them. And so for you to wear a wrist wrap and just kind of keep your wrists a little better in line, it can be a lot more comfortable and a lot more safe, and just make it a lot easier for you to support that heavy weight on your back. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about are squat shoes. I've mentioned this briefly before as we talked about your ankles and things like that. But a squat shoe has a couple different components. The first off is that it has a very hard sole. Like, I'm talking like it's like a block of wood on your sole. It's not very comfy, not cushiony at all. Of course, most of them are going to have like a rubber on them for grip's sake, and that's going to give you that small bit of cushion. But like, it's not a running shoe. It's not even a walking shoe. It's not very comfortable to walk in. It shouldn't bend very much at all. And the bottom of that sole is actually going to be completely flat. If you go look at your running shoe, it kind of has an arch and it has different, compartments oftentimes just to kind of distribute the load of your running throughout that shoe. But the squat is just going to be completely flat, so that way your base of support is distributed across your entire foot and can be as solid as possible. The next thing, as we've talked about, that it has is the elevated heel. Now, it can be a lot more beneficial than putting your feet up on like a plate or anything, because say if I am squatting with my heels up on a plate, I kind of just have a couple points of contact between my foot and the ground and that plate. Whereas I can still achieve that elevated heel with the squat shoe, but then my entire foot is in contact with that shoe and the entire bottom of the shoe is in contact with the ground. So you're getting that slightly elevated heel, but you are receiving the benefit of just, a little bit of extra stability and things like that. And squat shoes are really great for that base of support. Admittedly, I do feel like I need to disclaim this, but I don't use squat shoes just because I have never felt it in my budget to pay for them. They range from probably $90 to $200 to, I'm sure you could find some $500 pair that Olympics uses or whatever. They buy them, but they're a good pair. You're probably going to spend about $100 on. And so I just have never felt to use my budget for that. I squat in Vans, just skateboard shoes. And some people, Tom Platz or whoever is really going to kind of get on to me for that. I think that's not a good idea. And I understand. I'd love to get a pair of squat shoes. Probably coming up for my birthday, I'll get myself a pair. But we will totally see about that. And I just squat in skateboard shoes. And that kind of works well because, again, it has that super flat bottom, so your entire foot is in contact with the shoe, is in contact with the floor. And then it doesn't have that elevated heel, but aside from that, it's very durable and you can get it pretty tight. And so it can be pretty decent squat shoe for you. But squat shoes specifically are always going to be pretty good. Another benefit of squat shoes This is kind of just a product feature, but they oftentimes have laces and Velcro, and so you can kind of lace it up to a tightness that is comfortable to be in long term. But then right before you're about to go into your set, you can take that Velcro and kind of give yourself that extra little bit of tightness that you really want during the lift, and then go from there. And that's going to be it for the equipment for the squat. Again, that was your knee sleeves, your knee wraps, which are band, the singlet, the belt, the wrist straps, and squat shoes. And the next thing I wanted to talk about here was our accessories. We're going to start out first with a back extension. Is a huge one for me. I love to do back extensions just because like I said, I have had lower back issues in the past. And so for me, really just working my back extensors, keeping my lower back really, really strong is crucial for me. And I use it as a warm-up. I use it as a cool down. I really, really focus on my lower back. Some people don't need to focus on their lower back so much, and they still do great. And that's awesome. For me, I'd put it on the top of the list because it's super, super, super important for me. You know, if I did no accessories aside from the back extension, I'd probably do a pretty good job at squatting. I could just squat and do back extensions and be good forever. Back extensions for me are huge. But then there are some other things that you can do. Perhaps I should have defined accessory a little bit better. Basically, an accessory movement is some sort of exercise that's going to train the same or individual components of the muscles that are worked during this lift, but without doing the lift, right? So you're training your glutes, or you're training your quads, or your calves, or your lower back, but you're not training them by doing the squat. They're muscles that are used in your squat, but you're training them just separately from doing your squat. Some common squat accessories are going to be leg pressing movements. I mean, obviously starting with a leg press, you could do a machine leg press, or you could also do like a front squat. Those things are, squats. You're doing that sort of triple extension. I shouldn't say triple extension because that's supposed to be kind of more reserved for like the power sense, like Olympic weightlifting. So perhaps I'll stop saying that. But like your hip and knee extension, right? You're doing a compound leg pressing movement, which is the same as a squat, but you're just doing it a little differently. So if you're doing a leg press, you're going to take a lot of that stress off of your spine. You're not going to do as much spinal loading, but still be able to train your squatting muscles. If you do a front squat, it's going to be kind of the same way. A front squat focuses more on that upright posture, and then just a lot of people, you're not going to be as strong in your front squat as you are with your back squat, so you could still work those muscles. It's a little more quad dominant without as much spinal loading. Another one, of course, you could do is a leg extension machine. So you're just working your quads in isolation. You could do a calf raise machine. I prefer to do a calf raise with a straight leg just because the gastrocnemius muscle, which is the primary outside muscle of the calf, gets trained better in that lengthened position when you do have a straight leg as opposed to a seated position. Whereas the soleus grows better in a seated position, but it still grows when you have a straight leg. So for that reason, I recommend the straight leg because you're going to be able to functionally grow both. Some others you can do is a lunge. Again, you're doing this compound, leg press movement with a lunge. You could do, like I talked about, your Bulgarian split squat. You could do a glute bridge, right? Or so like a hip thrust to work your glutes. You could do things like a good morning, which is again going to be sort of a lower back extension or a glute extension. You can do, one thing I love is a Jefferson curl. That's going to be for your lower back as well. Maybe you've heard of that, but if you haven't, a Jefferson curl is basically, it's actually more similar to like a deadlift, but it really works your back. But what you try and do is work your back in a very safe way. What you're doing is you're literally lifting with your back. But again, you're trying to use a respectable weight and not kill it, but your back is meant to work. So the idea that some people have that whenever you lift weights, you need to keep your back like completely still and never move and always isometric is false. Your back is allowed to move, but we should train it to move properly. Not, you shouldn't do a deadlift with your back, but what you can do is something like a Jefferson curl. So basically what that is you grab sort of any sort of weight, perhaps a barbell, and then you stand with stiff legs, and then you bend all the way over as far as you can, and then you lift. You try and imagine yourself lifting that weight up like vertebra by vertebra, like individual up, kind of like a chain, just rolling upwards, pulling like each of your vertebrae at a time, and then getting that all the way up and rolling over. So we just going all the way down and slowly lifting by just rolling up your spine, and that's a Jefferson curl. I don't train the Jefferson curl for weights or for progress or anything, but I do commonly use it as a warm up, and it's something that I value in that regard. Another very, very prudent thing, as I have discussed, are adductors. Your adductors are used during a squat, so you could train your adductors in the adductor machine where you squeeze your legs together. I, again, don't do that because I train my legs, or my adductors, I apologize. I train my adductors as much as I really care for them to be trained in the squat itself, as well as, I don't know, I don't want too much adductor hypertrophy. I would definitely much rather it for strength, just because big adductors lead to chafing legs, which is not something that presumably many of you guys are very interested in. So for that reason, I don't train them. But another thing you could train as an accessory to your squat is a pause squat. So it's literally going to be a barbell back squat, but you're just going to pause at the bottom. And so nothing about the squat is different, no form is different or anything, but it's just a different way to do the lift itself. And that's something that you can do for all of the power lifts, your squat, bench, and deadlift. You just kind of play with the tempo, and that is technically going to be a form of accessory for your squat.